So I have a question. um,
Oh,
so scrolling through my introspective texts, I was thinking through a few weeks ago, like, why is nostalgia so powerful? If you know me,
like
you know I'm a sucker for a good, like, throwback early 2000s pop punk. Like, Fuse Dedicate Live is my aesthetic. So just trying to think through why is the power, the energy of nostalgia so compelling? And I feel like that's everyone, no matter what it looks like.
right.
And no, I will answer last, in the spirit of Leslie.
Ah. Okay, well then Kevin has to start us off. 'Cause I just feel like I've been talking for 90% of this episode. So,
So there I was,
a
sitting in my room, wishing I could crawl back into the womb of my mother in the fetal
wait a
position.
second. We have to note that Kevin is talking about crawling back into the womb of his mother, and he's gotten out this fluffy pillow again. And I think for our YouTube peoples, there's a correlation with this fluffy pillow and Kevin talking about things where he like needs to feel some sort of comfort. I think. Go ahead.
Ooh.
You're kicking psychology that I didn't even notice about myself, and it's making me uncomfortable. So there I was, sitting in my room, wanting to crawl back into the womb of my mother in the fetal position and stay there until life was over with. And it made me realize that kind of I think kind of like Leslie was saying, with the brain gets harder as we go along, and the elasticity of it and the ability of it to retain new ideas at the rate that it does when we're younger lessons. I think in the same way, the way we experience emotion, and positive emotion especially, deteriorates as we get older. So I think nostalgia is so powerful because almost as when you're a child, it's almost like someone poured a bucket of acid in your brain. And so you're experiencing novelty and originality and like a concentration of new experience, and you're experiencing it in as close to what can be considered a pure lens and filtration system as possible, with like almost as unless you had a very corrupt childhood, a very traumatic childhood, a very stained childhood early on, like death of a parent, someone like did something bad to you, molested you, XYZ. Sans a very traumatic experience, I think childhood, those years, are the ones where you experience the purest and the strongest of emotion, and you'll fall in love with a band or a Pokemon cards. Or so when you get older, in the same way that I wanted to crawl back into the womb of my mother, realizing psychologically that there is this strong association with comfort, I think nostalgia is one of the, whether it's a smell, a video game, a clothing item, a music, a song, I think it's a trigger in our brain of a time in our life when we are comforted or overjoyed by something, or experienced one of the purest forms of enjoyment that we could. And so almost like a drug, it's like a hit. You take a hit of that drug, and for a moment you get to escape. And that, almost like sitting in a movie theater watching a movie, you get nostalgia is your access pass, your golden ticket to momentarily escape now and go back to a time when you were happier and you did love life more than you do maybe now.
When I think about that question, I actually, one of the questions I had thought about asking was like, why is smell specifically such a trigger for nostalgia? So I start thinking about the big triggers, right? Like, I think probably the strongest ones I think that are agreed upon and that I definitely have experienced in my life are like smell and then music, I think.
Mm.
Um, like Alzheimer's pace. Is that how you pronounce it? Is it Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's? Anyway, Alzheimer's.
I don't think there's a T in it.
I don't know why for my longest time I thought it was Alzheimer's, and for some reason the Z was supposed to be pronounced as a T. Anywho, Alzheimer's patients will forget everything, but like if they hear a piece of music that they really liked, like they'll remember that. So I think about those first, and then I really vibed with everything you said, Kevin, and it's really interesting because that's not where I would have gone. But where I go naturally is thinking about the power of story, and there's been writings about this. I actually really want to read The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. Like that's on my coming up list to understand. Like it's a studied thing, like how impacted human beings are by stories, and it plays into everything, right? Like religion, like why we watch movies, why books, like when we share experiences, it's usually in a story format. If you think about it, you can do it in a bunch of other ways, right? Like if you just think about like improvisational dance, like that's a form of sharing that isn't following like a story. So there's other forms. But I would go to the idea of story and think about like nostalgia in relation to, you know, your memories, which are what comprise like things you're nostalgic about, are not the actual events. It's like your codified, it's what's made it into the story that now at like, you know, 29, right, Vincent? That at 29.
Wow, just making me older and older. Kevin's like
now
33.
At 28.
So you can use him instead.
That now at 28, like what you're nostalgic about with the music, like, right, it's not just the sounds of the music, it's thinking about like how you felt when you first heard it and what was going on. And it's not the actual experiences, it's the stories that you've told to yourself enough times in remembering it to where now it's like something else. So that's where I would go with it, is like it's somehow tied up with the same reasons why human beings are so affected by like stories in general and like a narrative format of information sharing.
To answer that might touch on both of yours, maybe. I think my main answer would be pretty similar to Kevin's, in that I feel like a lot of these things we're nostalgic for is just like a time capsule when we first experienced certain things at a time in our lives, generally when we were just experiencing a lot of things in life. So it was very impactful, and every time you do something that triggers it, you're brought back to that place of like awe, wonder, and new experience. What I think it's interesting about Leslie's point, though, is that I realized too, so for example, one trigger for nostalgia for me is the change of season from warm to cold and cold to warm. And I always get extremely nostalgic, and like the smells and the feels always take me back to feeling that as a kid. But it's such a strong provocation of nostalgia where every year I feel like I'm adding into that, because now I'm starting to be reminded of the season changing in college, which isn't the same time as me being a kid. But I feel like it's just because in that time I'm just
multiplication, right? Because in college you were nostalgic about being a kid, and now you're nostalgic about
and it's
being
just like
nostalgic about it in college. Yeah.
adding up into each other, which is interesting. Which might kind of go to like that stories and just creating a never ending story, an ever expanding narrative. I also think this is a rabbit hole, so I will just say this. I also think there's like a witchcraft to nostalgia, which is what got me thinking about it, and that nostalgia is so powerful. Is so powerful that people are leveraging, like often will leverage nostalgia to sell you things or to like redirect you from responding to things, and instead of just like daydreaming about what may or may not be a nostalgic time of the past. That's what got me on the rabbit hole. But that's why I think I think, at least for me and everyone that I know, and I think our generation, it's so powerful that it just like compels us all, which is why I think there's a witchcraft to it.
And that Christmas, his heart shrunk 3 sizes too small.